welcome back everyone. First off, some breaking news. The Chinese Communist Party's National Health Commission has declared that people who harvest the organs of living people under the age of 18 will face criminal prosecution in China. And it also claims to limit transplants to family members only. Now, this announcement, broadcast by the Chinese state media on July 2nd, is part of the draft version of the Regulations on Human Organ Transplantation. And the draft also states, quote, "In recent years we have accumulated a lot of experience in the acquisition, distribution, and management of human organs through practice. We formed a system of effective methods. In this revision, we set up the rules in this form of regulation to specify the institutional requirements for fair and equitable human organ acquisition and distribution." Now, that being said, it's unclear whether this will actually do away with the illegal or, say, state-run forms of organ transplantation, which heavily targets prisoners of conscience in China. It also raises some questions of if they need to create a law forbidding the harvesting of organs of people under the age of 18, how widespread was that practice? Now, moving on, meanwhile, floods and natural disasters are continuing in China. In Yunnan province in southwest China, waters surged overnight from the Baishui River, which made the flooding even worse. And again, there's flooding in 26 provinces at least right now. There were earthquakes in Sichuan province and Guizhou province. On July 2nd, a 3.2 magnitude earthquake in Sichuan hit Aba Prefecture upstream of the Three Gorges Dam. And soon after that, a 4.5 magnitude earthquake hit Guizhou. The earthquakes raised fears of potential landslides and overflow of the Three Gorges Dam, which has again been one of the main focuses right now. And in Chongqing of Sichuan province and in Yunnan province, there were large landslides caused by the heavy rains. Meanwhile, 2 CCP journalists have been deported from Taiwan, and the local government in Taiwan is raising concerns about some of the political propaganda being promoted there by CCP media. So 3 of the CCP's mouthpiece news outlets, CCTV, Southeast Television, and Haixia TV, are being hit with controversy for broadcasting CCP propaganda. On June 28th, the Taiwan Immigration Department named several state-run CCP news outlets, saying they came to Taiwan under the banner of journalism. Yet after getting in Taiwan, they've engaged in other activities. The outlets are being accused of using the excuse of conducting interviews as a front, and they're using that front as a way to push the CCP's propaganda. Now folks, before we jump into it, Crossroads is now going to be on cable. And NTD News is starting a full cable TV station, which Crossroads is going to be part of. You can find information on how to get that in the description below. Also, for our Patreon supporters, this Sunday we have a special treat. Epoch Times is releasing a new documentary. This one's called When the Plague Arrives. I had a bit of a hand putting this together. For our Patreon supporters, we're going to be showing this in place of the normal Q&A, so be sure to tune in. This is an early access for our Patreon supporters. Now with that said, let's jump into the first story of today. So first off, what does the new national security law in Hong Kong really entail? Sound of Hope had a great outline of this. Now, the national security law in Hong Kong supersedes existing laws, including Hong Kong's Basic Law and others that are supposed to protect basic freedoms. And the CCP's National People's Congress is now allowed to interpret the law. The CCP established what it calls a National Security Agency in Hong Kong, which is allowed to directly handle cases in, quote, special circumstances. And it's not specified what would qualify as a special circumstance. Anyone arrested under this law will be treated in the same way as mainland Chinese, and they will be denied basic rights, including the right to see a lawyer. This is being interpreted as the CCP extending direct control over the rights in Hong Kong, its judicial system, and its law enforcement. Now, under this national security law, judges in trials are required to be appointed by the chief executive of Hong Kong, which is regarded as a puppet of the CCP. Appointed judges are seen as having loyalty to the chief executive and to the CCP. And there are concerns this means cases in Hong Kong will be handled like they are in the mainland, where judges lose their independence, and the Mainland Political and Law Commission determines the judgment and the outcome of cases. The CCP has also included inciting subversion of state power in the Hong Kong version of the national security law, and is extending enforcement retroactively, meaning that if you violated this in the past, they can still go after you, and you face life in prison. And they're even extending this to foreign citizens in other parts of the world, even including in the United States. And now with that said, it's unlikely that the United States would allow the Chinese Communist Party to, say, arrest Americans and the United States would extradite them to China to face trial. But what this could mean is that if you have criticized the Chinese Communist Party, if you've written articles against the Chinese Communist Party, if you've done anything that would violate this national security law, which really includes any general criticism of the CCP, any undermining of the CCP, if you were to travel to another country or have a layover in another country while flying abroad that has an extradition treaty with the Chinese Communist Party, you could be sent to China and you could face trial. You could face life in prison. And the CCP would have the ability to basically, control the entire legal process and charge you with anything. That's what this means. And so yes, while they cannot very likely extradite Americans, if you travel, they could arrest you under this law. Now, of course, with this said, the CCP technically could have done this before through their own channels, but they've only now publicly implemented this through the national security law in Hong Kong. This is an interesting state because a lot of different countries were already putting pressure on the Chinese Communist Party to not pass these laws. Not only did the CCP pass them, but it passed harsher versions than anybody anticipated. Now, when it comes to the implementation of this law, it is kind of clear and it's kind of not clear. Basically, the Chinese Communist Party is saying that any subversion of its power, any kind of subversion of the CCP itself, which could mean anything that criticizes the CCP, which could mean any promotion of, say, Hong Kong democracy, which they would regard as separatism, anything that promotes Taiwan independence, which they would call separatism, criticisms of the Chinese Communist Party's human rights abuses, which they would regard as attacks on the CCP and its policies. All of these could be interpreted within the very broad context of this law. And so it's not that it's not clear, it's that the law is so incredibly vast that it could outlaw basically any type of criticism of the CCP or of its policies. And for anybody who needs to travel abroad, this could mean prison sentences in China. This could mean life in prison in China. And again, they're not just including Chinese people in this, and not just Hong Kongers in this, but pretty much any citizen in any part of the world. Now, moving on, Australia is building a new national defense plan that will build a military capable of challenging China. Now, Australia has always had an interesting stance when it comes to the Chinese Communist Party. When it comes to, say, the business and political community, a lot of them have been closer to the CCP. In fact, and there have been a lot of very heated political debates in Australia where different officials have accused other officials of basically being in China's pocket. Now, when it comes to that, they've also been very active, actually, in calling out some of the different forms of subversion in the country being done by the Chinese Communist Party, including in universities, again, including in their political system, and especially in their business sectors. And also the Australian military, the defense sector, does tend to regard China with, say, a more critical stance in many other countries, despite all of this. And so Australia has always had kind of a middle ground, back and forth stance when it comes to the CCP. But when it comes to this new move of preparing its military to building a military capable of fighting against the CCP, or at the very least of holding it off, this is a major move. Now, you might remember several years back, there was a book that was pretty well known in Australia. It was called The Kingdom and the Quarry. Now, it referred to China as the kingdom and Australia as its quarry. Regarding how the CCP regards Australia as basically its ore mines, where it can go for iron ore and different things. And the CCP has been trying to buy up GDP products in Australia, including the different mining industries. Part of that book warned that the CCP was planning attacks against the United States and also against Australia. And so what this shows is that Australia is now willing to more firmly stand up against the CCP and to do so more on the surface. And on this note as well, another update, China is warning New Zealand to, quote, stop interfering in our affairs after officials there criticized the CCP's new national security law. Now, attacks of the CCP and threats from the CCP like this have become more and more common. They have what were called these wolf warrior diplomacy policies. And so it's not just Australia, not just New Zealand. They've been calling out the UK. They've even been threatening US officials with retaliation for different statements they've made against the Chinese Communist Party. Now, will the Chinese Communist Party move forward with things like that? They're talking about it right now. They're talking about putting sanctions on different U.S. officials after U.S. officials have passed these bills now to put sanctions on different Chinese Communist Party leaders who have been engaged, for example, in these Hong Kong laws and in the persecution of Muslims in places like Xinjiang. And the CCP has also become more willing to use its influence over different international institutions to put pressure on different countries when it comes to them threatening or calling out the Chinese Communist Party. And also now there are increased reports in India about the CCP's use of subversion in the political system, business, and culture of Nepal. Now, Nepal stands between India and China, and the CCP has been putting a lot of pressure on Nepal because after the CCP conquered Tibet, took Tibet by force, many Tibetans fled to Nepal. The CCP has been using different forms of subversion so that while Nepal remains independent on the surface, CCP has found ways to subjugate Nepal to different extents by putting pressure on its politics, by subverting its economy, and by subverting the different elements of its open system. And India is taking that as a warning sign when it comes to these border conflicts that it's having with China. You might remember these stories. Chinese soldiers killed an estimated 20 Indian soldiers. They used metal poles with nails in them, and they used large stones, allegedly, according to reports. Now, India has been taking a stronger stance on China, and part of that stronger stance has been reports like this, where they're beginning to look more carefully at what the Chinese Communist Party has been doing in other countries when it comes to subverting them using open means, what the Chinese Communist Party would refer to as strangling you with your own systems. Now, moving on, China is demanding that U.S. news outlets submit information on their staff, finances, and real estate holdings in China. These outlets include the Associated Press, CBS News, NPR, and United Press International. This has been an ongoing tit-for-tat battle between the United States and China. The U.S. has been going after different Chinese state-run news outlets in the U.S., including measures like this, including, for example, restricting the amount of visas they can get, including putting many of them under the designation of foreign missions of the Chinese Communist Party based on their structures. In other words, they're no longer just foreign agents of the CCP acting on behalf of a foreign government. Many of them are now designated as being branches of the Chinese government, essentially, operating in U.S. soil. And the CCP has been pushing back on this in different forms. This is the latest chapter in that. But this is a move the CCP has very little to gain on, because already for businesses to operate in China, including news agencies, if they're going to be in China, if they're operating in China, they are already following, to an extent, the Chinese Communist Party's different requirements on news coverage. If you violate those principles, you will be kicked out of the country. You will lose your visas. Epoch Times is an example of this. Epoch Times actually was founded in 2000. We actually had reporters in China. They were arrested. Our editor spent 10 years in prison. That's what happens if you try to tell the truth in China as a journalist. Now, the CCP is going after these other news outlets that have already been operating in China and have already, to an extent, if they're there, they have to, been following some of the Chinese Communist Party's different requirements. This is unlike the ability of Chinese media to operate in the United States, where until very recently they've been given basically the same access as any other news outlet, even more so to an extent because many of these news outlets even had reporters in the White House. And so again, the Chinese Communist Party is fighting a losing battle. It's playing this tit-for-tat game, doing these retaliations against U.S. media. The only thing that will do is lead these media that already have very harsh criticisms against U.S. policy to begin putting more pressure on U.S. policy when it comes to putting pressure on the Chinese Communist Party. And that is very likely all we're going to see from this, at least based on my analysis. Now, yesterday I had the pleasure of interviewing Elmer Yuen. He's a Hong Kong businessman and one of the activists right now calling out the Chinese Communist Party for its new national security laws. We're going to jump into that now. Now, Elmer, it's a real pleasure having you on Crossroads.
Hi.
Yeah, so, well, first off, I understand you're in D.C. right now, and you're one of the more outspoken voices against what the Chinese Communist Party is doing. I guess first off, for you, what does this mean? Why do you feel it necessary to speak out?
Hong Kong is going to lose all its freedom, has already lost its freedom since yesterday because of this draconian national security law. They can do whatever they like. They can send their police. I think they're going to send at least 5,000 to 10,000 military police into Hong Kong. They have their own prosecutors, and they can appoint their own judge. and without going through the Hong Kong Final Court of Appeal. And they can even send the whatever suspect to China and have a trial in China. As you know, they can do whatever they like in China. There is no limit on detention before trial. There's nothing. It's a lawless country. That's what it is.
I know the Chinese Communist Party is now saying they can go after people retroactively, meaning that not just going forward, but if in the past they believe you violated this law, you risk life in prison. And
Exactly.
I know, and here you
They
are.
can go through your phone record or your emails. And not only Hong Kong residents, they have the right to go over anybody in the world. Suddenly, they have the whole world as their jurisdiction. It's unbelievable. Let me explain to you. It's not even a country. China is basically a gangster's land. So there's no nation, there's no government. Everything belongs to the party. And the party is really a few families, like the crime families, and dominated by them. And the country is a facade. Right? Government is a facade. Behind every government official, there's a party secretary pulling the strings. Even behind every business, there is a party secretary pulling the string. So it's really not a country. It's a huge land, this greater China, with one party, and inside the party, few families. And then they have 90 million gangsters and 1.4 million basically slaves. That's what the hierarchy is. And Hong Kong is a separate area with freedom. And we are the free Chinese, and they are the slave Chinese. That is the difference. They don't want the free Chinese to survive. They want the free Chinese to live the same way as they do. That's what the law is for.
And I know that it's brave for people to be speaking out right now. One thing that surprised me was after the Chinese Communist Party threatened people with life in prison, you still had a large number of Hong Kong protesters take to the streets. And I know even you yourself, they could come after you for this. And you're here speaking with me about
my family.
this.
They can take my family as a hostage to shut me up. And I was also surprised how many people went to the street on July 1st.
Now, one thing that surprised me, I honestly did not expect the Chinese Communist Party to do something so overt, to do something so in the light, plain as day, making it clear basically that everything the Hong Kong people were afraid was going to happen has in fact happened. They're not trying to hide it. And this surprised me for one main reason, which is that the Chinese Communist Party uses Hong Kong as its basically, business hub to reach the West. It uses it as a free trade hub, and it has now sacrificed that. The U.S. is now looking to end the different kinds of trade benefits that Hong Kong was given. And I'm curious from you, I know you're a businessman from Hong Kong. How do you see this affecting business in Hong Kong, and why would the CCP do something like that would harm its own self-interest for the sake of this?
Joshua, when their economy is doing well, when their power, the CCP's power, is not challenged, they would do what you are saying. They have no reason to sacrifice Hong Kong's economy and the ability to earn US dollars for them. But in the last few years, Xi Jinping feels that he's threatened. There are so many fractions inside China and outside, threatening his position. So that's why he's willing to sacrifice the Hong Kong economy, the China economy, and also those stolen wealth of those rich families outside, because they may be sanctioned, all these high officials. He's sacrificing all those for his own staying in power. As simple as this. The communists, the way they become, it's very much like a gang family. When their power is threatened, they are willing to sacrifice their own gangsters or their own people or even their own family. That's the way it works. Very different from ours. We have an orderly transfer of power. They don't. So the way they grab power, Xi Jinping spent the whole life from beginning of the term to now grabbing power because they feel so insecure. There is no rule how to transfer power. So that's why they're sacrificing everything. They know the whole world is against them. So Hong Kong finished. We're going to be a dead city. And the Chinese economy, nobody wants to buy anything from them. As a result, those wealthy families' money will be all sanctioned and frozen by the US. Sooner or later, it's all happening now.
Now, I'm curious, going forward, what do you see happening to Hong Kong? First off, do you think people are going to actually stop protesting? Do you think that they will be willing to bow down to the CCP? Really after living their whole lives in democracy and suddenly overnight, those freedoms are taken away. What do you see happening to Hong Kong going forward?
These Cantonese will continue to protest. right? But the problem is not Hong Kong. U.S. is terribly hurt by the pandemics. 120,000 and going up to 200,000 people will die. And this is a bloody debt. U.S. must get them to pay. That is the main issue. So I've met many senators in the last few weeks. They are under pressure from their voters to do something dramatic because somebody died. I just met a congressman from New Jersey. 13,000 people died. When have you heard a state, one New Jersey, and I'm very familiar with New Jersey, 13,000 people died and more on the way. He has to do something. So it's not just, the Hong Kong is just a reason for them to do something. But U.S. will have to escalate. And Xi Jinping also have to escalate. It's going to be a war. As simple as that. I know nobody loves war, especially outside China, in our peaceful, free world. But the escalation is going to be, because nobody dares to back down. Xi Jinping cannot back down. If he backs down, he's finished. Donald Trump, with the re-election coming, and also with the whole world supporting him, he cannot back down either. So it's going to be escalation, which will lead to war. It could be a currency war, it could be a financial war, and eventually it may even lead to a kinetic war.
And now tell us, in your own views, why is the potential of the fall of Hong Kong something to the world that matters to the world? Why is this something that people around the world should really care about, in your opinion?
We have, in Hong Kong, we share the same universal value with the whole world except China, all right? Except China or maybe North Korea and Iran. So we share your value. So if Hong Kong is lost, it's very similar to Berlin. It's like losing Berlin. You remember, U.S. used to airlift into Berlin, West Berlin, just to save them. It's the value, right? It's the freedom and the value we share. And that's why U.S., of course, they're not only doing it for Hong Kong, but that is an opportunity and open up for U.S. to do something with the background of the pandemic loss. So that's the reason U.S. wants to be involved. And that is the first line of defense. And if they lose Hong Kong, the next may be Taiwan, the next may be Southeast Asia, or the South China Sea. So for U.S. represent the whole free world, they also need to win in Hong Kong.
I guess just last question, if you would hope people understand one thing about what Hong Kong means for the world, about what's happening right now, what would you tell them?
It's the civilized world against the barbaric world. China is the barbaric world. You see how they legislate this law, the national security law, you know how barbaric it is. Only when they're ready to publish, they let everybody see the detail. You don't get to see the detail. This is the way they pass a law. That is how barbaric they are. They are still in Middle Ages. We live in a civilized world. When we have a law, it has to go through lots of inquiry, first reading, second reading, and voting. All they do is they did everything and then publish it in Hong Kong Gazette. So you understand, one simple sentence. It's the civilized world against the barbaric world. And that war has to be fought right now. That's all I want to say.
Great, Elmer. Really appreciate it. Anything else you'd like to say? Any points you feel we missed you want to touch on?
No, thank you for supporting Hong Kong.
Now, with that said, folks, again, the show, we're broadcasting Monday through Friday, 5 days a week. And also on Sundays, we're going to be doing a live Q&A for our Patreon supporters. With that said, please take care of yourselves, stay healthy, stay free.